The cold came to the house on the Rabnitz road, the way a creditor comes, without knocking, certain of its welcome, settling into the chairs as though it had always owned them. It seeped through the mortar of the old Faulkner cottage and lay along the window-sills in a fine grey rime, and it did not leave when the fire was lit, for the fire was small and the wood was rationed, and the winter that year had teeth. Ottilie Faulkner knew the cold, as one knows a companion of long standing. She had learned its habits. She knew which floorboards it favoured, which corners it loved, how it pooled at the foot of her father's bed and made his breathing rattle like a coin dropped in an empty box. She was 24 that winter, and she wore a dress of faded grey wool that had once belonged to her mother, mended so many times at the elbows and hem that the mending had become the garment, and she moved through the failing house in that grey dress, like a shadow that had learned to be useful. There had been money once. There had been a time when Aldous Faulkner had been the physician the great family sent for, when the cottage had smelled of clove and candle wax and pressed linen, when there had been a servant to lay the fires and a horse in the little stable, and a future spread before them like a clean cloth. But her mother had died, and grief had made her father careless, and carelessness had made him trusting, and a trusting man in a hard country is a purse waiting to be cut. He had signed for a friend's debt. The friend had fled. The debt had not. Now the physician who had once mended others couldn't mend himself, and lay grey against his grey pillow, coughing, while the men who held his paper circled the house like patient dogs. Ottilie did not weep about it. She had decided long ago that tears were a currency she could not afford to spend, that every one she wept was a coin thrown into a well that gave nothing back, and so she kept them, hoarded them, spent instead her hands and her patience and her plain, unglamorous competence. She sold the good linen. She sold the horse. She sold, at the last, the little enamelled watch her mother had worn against her breast, and she did not let herself feel the loss of it, only counted the shillings into her palm, and thought which mouth they would feed, and for how long. Neighbours said the Faulkner girl was hard. Neighbours are often wrong in the same direction. She was not hard. She was merely holding the roof up with her spine, and a spine held that long forgets how to bend without breaking, and she had chosen, in the small dark hours when even the cold slept, that she wouldn't break. She rose before light and split the kindling herself. She boiled the thin barley and coaxed it into her father as though feeding a bird. She read to him from the physician's texts he could no longer see well enough to hold, and she pretended not to notice how his hand shook when it reached for hers. And when the man from the moneylender came, as he came now every second week, a soft-spoken man in a good coat named Herr Voss, who smelled of snuff and satisfaction, she met him at the door herself, and did not let him past it, and she spoke to him plainly, without pleading, because pleading was a currency too, and she would not spend that either. "There is a fortnight yet," she told him. "You will have your fortnight, and not one day less." He looked at her grey dress and her steady eyes, and something in him grew uneasy, for he was accustomed to weeping, and he did not know what to do with a woman who would not. He tipped his hat. He said that the account had grown, that the interest was a living thing, and it too must eat, that soon a fortnight would not answer, and something more would be required, and he let the something more hang in the frozen air between them, like breath. She understood him. She understood that a young woman without money has only one thing the world will trade for, and that the world would come, sooner or later, to name its price. She shut the door on him, and leaned her forehead against the wood and counted. 1, 2, 3, the way she had taught herself to count when the fear rose, until the fear lay down again. Then she went and split more kindling, because the cold did not care that she was afraid, and the fire would not lay itself. It was 3 days later, in the blue hour before a snow, that the carriage came. She heard it before she saw it, the wrong sound entirely for that poor road, iron-shod wheels ringing on the frozen ruts, and the blow of horses bred for better country than this, and she went to the window and wiped the frost with her sleeve, and saw the black lacquer of a great coach with a crest upon the door, a falcon stooping over a broken tower, and knew before she knew anything else that this was not the money-lender, and that her life had come to one of its hinges. The man who stepped down did not hurry. He was tall and dark and dressed in mourning that was too old to be recent grief and too well kept to be forgotten, and he stood a moment in the cold, surveying the tumble-down cottage with a face that gave away precisely nothing, a face built like the front of a strong-box, all planes and locks and no windows. This was Constantin von Eichendorff, Herzog of the mountain lands to the north, a name spoken in the valleys the way one speaks of weather that has ruined a harvest, with respect and resentment in equal parts. They called him the Frost Duke. They said he had let his wife die and had not wept. They said he kept his gold in ice and his heart with it. They said he had shut up his great castle at Rabenstein and dismissed half its servants, and that no music had played there in 3 years, and that he came down among ordinary men only to collect what was owed him, for he had bought, in the lean years, a great deal of paper. He came to the door and he did not knock softly. Ottilie opened it in her grey dress with flour on her hands, for she had been stretching the last of the meal into bread, and she looked up at him without flinching. And this, too, was not what he was accustomed to, for people flinched. It was the natural motion of the poor before the powerful, and its absence registered on him the way a missing stair registers on a foot in the dark. "I am looking for the physician Faulkner," he said. His voice was low and flat and without music, a voice that had learned to say only what was necessary and nothing warm. "My father is ill," she answered. "He cannot receive you. Whatever business you have, you may put it to me." 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. He studied her, this plain young woman who barred his way as though the doorway of a hovel were the gate of a fortress. And then he said the thing that changed everything, said it as though reading it from a ledger, without cruelty and without kindness. "I hold your father's debts," he said. "All of them. Herr Voss sold his paper to me a week ago. Your family owes me more than this house, and everything in it could answer 3 times over." She did not move. "Then you have come to take the house," she said. "No," he said. "I have come to make you an offer, and you would do well to hear it before you decide what I am." So she stood aside and let the Frost Duke into the poor cold parlour, and he sat in her father's chair as though it were made for him, and he laid his gloves across his knee, 1 finger at a time, and he told her, in that flat and joyless voice, that he required a wife. She did not laugh, though a lesser or a happier woman might have, for the words were absurd. A duke seeking a bride in a debtor's parlour, a falcon come to court a wren. She only waited, because she had learned that men who speak plainly are best answered with silence, which draws the rest of the truth out of them the way salt draws water, and the rest of the truth came. He did not want love, he said, and here he looked at her as though daring her to want it, and finding no such wanting in her face, went on more easily. He wanted a wife-in-law and name only. He had reasons that were his own, and would remain so. He required a woman of sound sense and steady nerve, who could keep a house and hold her tongue, who had no family to make demands and no expectations to be disappointed. A woman, he said, whom the world would overlook. He said this last without seeming to know it was cruel, and she took it without seeming to be wounded, because it was only true, and truth she could bear. In exchange, he said, every debt her father held would be struck out as though it had never been written. A physician would come from the city and attend the old man for as long as he lived. The cottage would be kept, the fire fed, the winter answered. And she herself would be a duchess, though he said the word the way one names a duty rather than a gift. She asked him why. Why her? Why now? Why a stranger from a doorway when the world was full of ambitious daughters who would leap at his crest? And for the first time something moved behind the strong box of his face. Not much, only the smallest tightening at the corner of the mouth. The shadow of a door pulled almost shut. Because they would leap, he said. Because I have no use for a woman who wants this. I have use only for one who does not. Then he named a day, 3 days hence, and rose and drew on his gloves, finger by finger, and told her he would have her answer by messenger, and that she need not thank him, for it was not kindness, it was a transaction, and both of them would do well to remember it. When he had gone, the parlour seemed colder for having held him, as though he had taken some of its little warmth away in the folds of his black coat. Ottilie went and sat by her father, who had heard some of it through the thin wall, and lay with his eyes wet and shining in the failing light. "Do not do this thing," he whispered. "Not for me. I would rather the debt." She took his shaking hand between both of hers, and she did not weep, though the well of her tears trembled at its brim, and she said only, "You raised me to be useful, father. Let me be useful." She thought of the fortnight that was nearly spent, and the something more that Herr Voss had left hanging in the air, and she understood that the world had come to name its price, after all, and that here at least the price bought something real, a physician's hands upon her father, a fire that would not go out. She thought too, though she told no one, that there had been something in the Frost Duke's flat voice she recognized, a person holding a roof up with his spine and forgetting how to bend, and she wondered what winter had got into his house and would not leave. She sent her answer the next morning, before she could think better of it. 3 words in her careful hand. "I will come." And so the wren went up the mountain to live in the falcon's tower, in her mother's mended grey dress, with everything she owned in a single canvas bag, and behind her the cold followed a little way up the road, and then, finding nothing more to take, turned back. Schloss Rabenstein was a house that had forgotten it was meant to be lived in. It stood on a shoulder of the mountain where 2 valleys met, a pile of grey stone, the colour of a coming storm, its towers wrapped in cloud more days than not, its windows dark, its great doors banded in iron gone black with age. Within, it was colder than the cottage had ever been, for the cottage had been small and its cold intimate, and this was cold made vast, cold with room to move, cold that lived in the long galleries and the shrouded rooms where the furniture stood under dust sheets like a congregation of ghosts. Half the hearths were dead, the other half burned low and grudging, tended by too few servants who moved through the corridors with the hushed, watchful step of people who had learned that the master preferred not to be reminded they existed. There had been 40 in service once, Ottilie learned. Now there were 11, and they kept to the servants' hall and the kitchen wing, and left the great house to its silence. No one had told them why the Duke had sent the others away. No one asked, She was received without ceremony. A marriage of a paragraph performed by a nervous parish priest in a chapel where the candles guttered in the draught, witnessed by 2 servants and the Duke's grandmother. And then it was done, and she was the Duchess von Eichendorff, and no one in that cold house looked at her as though it meant anything at all. The grandmother was the exception. The Dowager Wilhelmina von Eichendorff was near 80, and sat in a wheeled chair by the one good fire in the house, with a rug across her knees and a mind like a whetted blade, and she watched the whole thin ceremony with her black eyes, moving from her grandson to the plain grey bride and back, missing nothing. When it was over, she summoned Ottilie to her, with the crook of one ringed finger, and looked her up and down without pretending she wasn't doing it. "So," she said, "you are the bargain he struck in a ditch." Ottilie met her eye. "I am, madam," she said. "I do not scheme, I do not flatter, and I will not weep in your presence. So if you were hoping for entertainment, you must look elsewhere." 1 second. 2 seconds. And then the old woman laughed, a dry, cracked sound like a branch giving way, and said, "Well, he has done one sensible thing in 3 years. Sit down, girl, and tell me you can play piquet, for I am dying of dullness, and the rest of them are afraid of me." And that was how Ottilie Faulkner made, in her first hour as a duchess, the only ally in that house she would need. There was another woman at Rabenstein, and she was not an ally. Ottilie met her at supper that first night, at the far end of a table so long that the 2 ends could scarcely have held a conversation without shouting. A table laid for the Duke, his grandmother, his new wife, and a 4th who swept in late in a gown the colour of wine, jewels at her throat catching the candlelight, her beauty arranged upon her face the way silver is arranged upon a table, deliberately, for effect. This was Cosima, the Duchess Cosima von Straubing, widow of a cousin of the house, who had come 3 winters past to comfort the grieving Constantine, and had somehow never gone away again, and who now occupied the warmest rooms in the castle and the nearest approach to its heart, and who had, everyone understood without anyone ever saying it, expected to be the next Duchess of Eichendorff herself. She looked at Ottilie the way a cat looks at a sparrow that has flown into its house by accident, with a hunger that has all the time in the world. "My dear," she said, her voice warm as poured honey and cold beneath it as the stone floor, "what a quaint little thing you are. Constantine, wherever did you find her?" The Duke did not answer. He ate in silence at the head of his table, remote as a lighthouse, and gave neither woman more of his attention than a nod. But Cosima's eyes stayed on Ottilie all through that endless, silent meal, taking in the mended grey dress she had refused to change out of, the roughened hands, the plain hair, cataloguing her, weighing her, and finding her, visibly and with satisfaction, nothing. "I can hire 50 like you," her whole manner said, though she did not yet say the words aloud. Ottilie ate her soup and held her tongue, and watched them all in that ringing cold room, the frozen Duke, and the vain, beautiful widow, and the fierce old woman by the fire, and she thought that she had married into a house that was, in every way that mattered, at war with itself, and that no one in it had smiled in a very long time. She began, as she had always begun, with her hands. She was not asked to. She was not, in truth, expected to do anything at all but exist quietly, as a name on a marriage line, and a body between Cosima and the thing Cosima wanted. And had she chosen, she might have spent her days as an idle ornament in unfamiliar silk. But idleness was a thing Ottilie had never been able to bear, and a cold house was a wound she did not know how to leave alone. So she rose, that first full day, before the servants, and she found the kitchens, and she made the acquaintance of the cook, a harried, thin woman named Frau Henrik, who had been trying for 3 years to feed a household on the master's grief, and had grown bitter in the trying. And Ottilie did not command her, only asked, only rolled up the sleeves of the grey dress, and set to kneading beside her. And by noon the two of them were friends, or something near it, and the kitchen smelled of bread for the first time in longer than anyone could remember. From the kitchen she went outward through the house, like warmth spreading from a hearth. She learned the servants' names, all 11, and used them, and asked after their people, and remembered the answers. She found the linen presses full of good cloth gone grey with damp, and had it out, and aired in the 1 hour of thin sun the mountain allowed. She found 100 small dead things in that great house, and quietly, without announcement, began to bring them back. And she found, in the west wing, behind a door that was kept locked, the secret at the centre of the whole cold place. She had not meant to find it. She had been tracing a draught, a bitter thread of cold air that ran along the floor of the west gallery, meaning to stop it, and it led her to a door, and behind the door she heard, faint and thin, the sound of a child coughing. She stood very still. The door was locked, but a key hung on a nail beside it, hidden behind a fold of tapestry, as though someone wished the room both sealed and reachable. And she took it, and she let herself in. It was a warm room. The only truly warm room in the castle, she would later realize, its fire kept high, and in a bed by that fire lay a boy of perhaps 6 years, small and pale as candle wax, his dark eyes too large for his thin face, and one side of that face marked from brow to jaw with a wine-dark stain that spread across the skin like a map of some country of sorrow. He looked at her without fear, only with the deep, incurious calm of a child who has been ill so long that new faces have stopped meaning very much. "Are you the new one?" he asked. Grandmother said father brought a new one. The boy's name was Caspar. He was the Duke's son. And the whole silent war of that frozen house, Ottilie understood in a single breath, was being fought over him. She sat with him that day, and did not leave until the light failed. She learned that he had been born with the mark upon his face, and with a weakness in his chest that turned every winter cold into a battle for his breath, and that his mother, the young Duchess, had died bringing him into the world, and that the physicians had shaken their heads over him from his first hour, and had gone on shaking them ever since. She learned that his father came to him every evening without fail, and sat with him an hour and read to him, and that this hour was the one place in all his frozen life where the frost duke wasn't frozen, though the boy did not seem to know how rare a thing he received. She learned that he had never been allowed beyond that room, that he had never played in a garden or ridden a pony or been seen by the world, because the world, in the person of a great house full of grand relations, had a way of looking at a marked and sickly air and finding him wanting, and his father had chosen to hide him rather than let him be wounded. And she learned, though the child could not have told her this and did not, that a hidden heir is a fragile thing, that an heir no one has seen and no one can vouch for is an heir who can be more easily set aside, and that somewhere in the arithmetic of inheritance, the boy in the warm room was a sum that other people wished to see subtracted. She did not tell him any of this. She only asked him what he liked, and he said, after long thought, that he liked stories with foxes in them, and that he had once seen, from his window, a real fox crossing the snow at dawn, red as a coal against the white, and that it had been the finest thing he had ever seen. So she told him a story with a fox in it, made up on the spot, clumsy and warm, and when she rose to go, he asked, in the small, careful voice of a child who has learned not to want too loudly, whether she would come again tomorrow. She said she would, and she did, and the day after, and the day after that, until coming to the warm room in the west wing became the fixed point around which her days at Rabenstein turned. She did not seek the Duke's permission. She did not know at first that he knew. But he knew. A servant told him within the day that the new Duchess had found the boy, and he went to the locked room that evening, braced for the thing he had learned to expect from people, the flinch, the pity, the carefully hidden distaste, or worse, the calculation, the sudden interest of a woman who has discovered where a house keeps its weakness. He found instead his son laughing, thin and breathless and delighted, at a plain woman in a grey dress who was on the floor by his bed pretending to be a fox, and the Frost Duke stood in the doorway unseen for the length of one held breath, and something in the strong box of his chest, some long rusted mechanism, turned over once, painfully, and didn't quite close again. If you are finding your way into this cold mountain house alongside Ottilia, and you would like to walk the rest of the road with her, to the Thor and the roses, and the moment the whole plot comes crashing down, then take a moment now to subscribe, so that the next story like this one finds its way to you when the nights are long and you have need of it. And now, back to Rabenstein, where the ice had begun, very quietly, to crack. The change in the Duke was not sudden, and it was not announced. It came the way spring comes to that high country, in reversals and false starts, a warmth one day and a hard frost the next, so that a stranger might have missed it entirely. But Ottilie was no stranger to reading the small motions of a guarded face, having watched her father's for signs of pain through his long decline, and she read the Duke now, and saw what was happening in him before he did. He began to appear at the boy's room while she was there, and to stay, sitting stiff and silent in the chair by the fire while she told her clumsy fox stories. And though he said little, he did not leave, and his not leaving was itself an eloquence. He began to speak to her at meals, a sentence, two, brief flat questions about the household, whether the west wing chimney had been seen to, whether Frau Henrika had what she needed, and she answered plainly and asked her own questions in return. And slowly the ringing silence of that endless table filled, meal by meal, with the modest human sound of two people finding they could talk to one another. She had, without asking anyone, been making the great house smaller and warmer around them. She had the dust sheets taken off the small dining parlour near the kitchen, and moved their suppers there to a round table where the three of them, the Duke and his grandmother and his wife, could sit within arm's reach and be warm, and Cosima, who was not invited because she had never troubled to be kind to the servants who did the inviting, found herself for the first time on the outside of something, and did not forget it. Ottilie had the library opened, a great vaulted room that had been shut since the young Duchess died, its books furred with dust, its shutters barred, and she cleaned it herself over the course of a week, coughing in the grey clouds she raised. And when the Duke found her there one evening on a ladder with a cloth in her hand, and his dead wife's favourite room breathing again around her, he did not, as she half feared, order it shut. He stood a long while among the books. Then he said, very low, she loved this room, and Ottilie, on her ladder, said simply, then it should not have been left to die. And that was all. But it was a great deal. There was a garden, too, or the bones of one, a walled plot on the southern shoulder of the mountain, where some optimistic ancestor had tried to make roses grow in defiance of the altitude and the wind, and it had gone to briar and ruin. But Ottilie saw that in the sheltered angle of the south wall, a few of the old bushes still lived, gnarled and thorny and stubborn. And she began, in the strengthening light of that mountain spring, to bring them back. She pruned the dead wood, and turned the frozen soil, and carried water. And Caspar, wrapped in furs, was allowed at last, on the warmest days, to be carried out to sit in the sun and watch her work, his marked face turned up to the light like a plant that has been kept too long in a cellar. And the Duke would come and stand at the garden gate and watch them both, his wife with earth on her hands, and his son with colour at last in his cheeks, and the almost of a smile would cross his hard face, not quite arriving, only the shadow of where a smile would be, and it undid him a little more each time. It was in the revived library, on a night of wild wind, that the Duke told her the truth he had married her to keep. He had come to find her there, as he had begun to do, and she had poured him wine from the decanter Frau Henrike now kept warm by the library fire, and they had sat a while in the companionable silence that had grown up between them like moss on a stone. And then he had said, without prelude, in that flat voice she had learned to hear the tremor beneath, "You have not asked me why I hide my son." She had not, because she had understood it was his to give when he chose. He gave it now. He told her of his wife, Aurelia, whom he had loved, married young and loved wholly, and of her death in the bearing of Caspar, and of how he had stood in the room where she died, holding a marked and struggling infant, and had made a vow over her cooling body that no one would ever look at their child the way he had already seen the physicians look, the way he knew the world would look, with that swift downward flick of the eyes that measures a person and finds him less. So he had hidden the boy. He had shut up the house and sent away the servants who gossiped and drawn the whole cold silence of Rabenstein around his son like a wall, and he had told himself it was protection, and had known in the sleepless part of himself that it was also a prison, and had not known how to unlock a door he had spent 3 years learning to keep shut. And then, he said, and here he looked at her, across the firelight, with something open and defenceless in his strong box face. And then a woman came up my mountain in a mended grey dress, and opened every door in my house without asking my leave. And my son laughed, and I did not know, until I heard it, how long it had been since anything in this place had made a sound worth keeping. Ottilie sat very still. She understood that she was being handed something, and that it was heavier than any debt her father had signed, and she chose her words the way she chose everything, plainly and without waste. "Then we will unlock the rest of them," she said. Together, and the Duke, who had married her to be overlooked, looked at her then as though she were the only lit window in a country of dark houses, and said quietly, "You are not what I expected." It was not a declaration. It was better than one, because it was true, and both of them knew it, and neither of them yet dared to name the larger truth that had begun to grow in the warm rooms of that cold house, the truth that this bargain, this transaction, this arrangement of paragraphs and paper had somewhere along the mountain road become a marriage after all. Cosima von Straubing was not a stupid woman, and stupidity was the only thing that might have saved her, for a stupid woman would not have seen what she saw, and what she saw was that she was losing. She had come to Rabenstein 3 years before, with a clear map of her future drawn upon it. She would console the grieving Duke. She would make herself indispensable. She would be beautiful and near and patient. And in time, when his grief had worn thin enough, she would become his second Duchess and the mistress of his lands, and, through the convenient fragility of his hidden heir, the mother of his true one. It had been a good plan, and it had been ripening nicely. And then a debtor's daughter in a grey dress had walked into the house and married the man out from under her in a single afternoon, and now, worse, was making the house love her. Cosima watched Ottilia move through Rabenstein, spreading her quiet warmth, and she understood with a cold clarity that if she did nothing, she would grow old in the second warmest rooms of a house that belonged, in every way that mattered, to a wren. So she began, as such women begin, with words. She was too clever at first for open cruelty. She worked instead in the soft country of the aside, the raised eyebrow, the sentence that wounds while seeming to praise. "How brave of you," she would murmur to Ottilie before the servants, "to wear the same dress so very often. It must be such a relief not to trouble about how one appears." Or to a visiting cousin, in a whisper pitched to Carrie, "One does feel for Constantine, marrying so far beneath himself out of some fit of charity, though I suppose a man will do strange things in his grief." She spread it in the valley, too, on the rare journeys down the mountain, the story of the Frost Duke's mad marriage, the physician's daughter bought out of a ditch, the schemer who had trapped a grieving man, and the story travelled as such stories do, and grew as it travelled, and came back up the mountain, fatter and uglier than it had gone down. Ottilie bore it as she bore the cold, without flinching and without complaint, because she had learned long ago that a slander answered is a slander fed, and she would not feed it. But the old Dowager Wilhelmina bore it less patiently. From her wheeled chair by the fire, she watched Cosima's campaign with her black eyes narrowing, and she said to Ottilie one evening, over the piquet cards, "That woman is a snake, girl, and I have lived long enough to know that a snake that is losing does not slither away. It strikes. Mind yourself. Mind the boy." Ottilie minded the warning, but she did not yet understand its full weight, until the day she overheard the thing that turned her blood to river ice. She had gone to the still room off the kitchens for honey for Caspar's cough, moving quietly as she always moved, and she had heard voices through the half-open door of the little apothecary closet beyond, where the old physical remedies of the house were kept, the dried herbs and the tinctures and the small dark bottles. And one voice was Cosima's, low and urgent, and the other was a man's, a travelling apothecary she did not know, and she stood in the shadow of the honey shelves, and she listened, and what she heard was Cosima asking, in a voice stripped now of all its honey, how much of a certain thing would be needed, and how long it would take, and whether it could be made to look like the boy's own weak chest, like a fever, like nothing at all. And the man answered in numbers, and Cosima said, "And for a grown man? A large man?" And the man answered in numbers again. And Ottilia stood in the dark with the honey jar cold in her hands, and understood that the slander had only ever been the overture, and that the true plot was murder, and that it was not the boy alone who was meant to die. She did not go at once to the Duke. This was the discipline that had kept her family alive through the lean years, and it did not desert her now. The knowledge that an accusation without proof is only another kind of gossip, and that a woman of grey wool accusing a woman of jewels would be believed by no court and no gathering in the land unless she came armed with something no denial could turn aside. So she did the hard, patient, frightening thing. She watched. She said nothing to anyone, not even to the Dowager, whose fierce tongue might have struck too soon and warned the snake. She moved through her days as though she had heard nothing, telling Caspar his fox stories, tending the roses that were now in stubborn bud, sitting with the Duke in the firelit library, and all the while she watched Cosima the way she had once watched the moneylender through the frost. And she learned. She learned that Cosima had begun, with sudden sweetness, to interest herself in the Duke's habits, in what he ate and when, and above all in the wine. For the Duke took, each night before he went to his son, a single glass of a particular dark wine from a particular decanter that stood on the sideboard in the small parlour, a habit as fixed as the turning of the earth. She learned that Cosima had grown solicitous of Caspar too, had begun to offer, with tender concern, to carry up the boy's evening posset herself, and that Frau Henrika, who did not trust her, but could not refuse a lady of the house, had begun to let her. And Ottilie understood the shape of the thing then, entire and terrible. The wine for the man, the posset for the child, and one night, chosen carefully, both at once, and in the morning, a grief-broken house would find its master dead of an apoplexy, and its sickly air gone at last of the weakness that had always been going to take him, and no one would look twice, and the nearest kinswoman, the beautiful patient widow, would be left to console the mountain, and, in time, to inherit it. It was so clean, it was so nearly perfect, and against it, Ottilie had nothing but her eyes, and her certainty, and a discipline of watching, and she knew she would get one chance, one only, to turn the thing over in the light where everyone could see it, and that if she moved too soon or too clumsily, she would lose it, and perhaps her own life with it, for a plot that will kill a child will not balk at a wren. So she waited, coiled and quiet, through days that stretched her nerves like harp strings, and she made her preparation, the only one she could. She went, on a pretext of restocking her father's old remedies, to the honest apothecary in the town 3 valleys over, an aged, incorruptible man who had known her father, and she described to him, without naming names, the numbers she had overheard, and she asked him how such a poison behaved, how it might be found, what signs it left, and above all whether there was a way to prove a thing was in a cup before a doubting crowd. And the old man, understanding more than she said, and asking nothing, gave her what she needed, a small vial of a clear reagent that would turn, he told her, a deep and unmistakable black in the presence of that particular poison, and in the presence of nothing else. And he closed her fingers around it, and said only, "God go with you, child, and mind you are quick." The night came, as she had known it would, cloaked in respectable innocence. It was the eve of the dowager's birthday, and Cosima, all sweetness, had proposed a small family supper to honour the old woman, and had busied herself charmingly about the arrangements, and Ottilie, watching, had seen her go twice to the sideboard in the small parlour, and had seen her hand pass, once, over the dark decanter, and had felt her own heart turn to a slow, cold fist in her chest. The family gathered. The Dowager Wilhelmina in her best lace, sharp-eyed and pleased despite herself. Caspar, a rare and joyful presence at the table, carried down and propped in cushions, his marked face bright with the excitement of being included. Cosima in wine-dark silk, luminous, attentive, pouring the old woman's health in honeyed words. And the Duke at the head of his table, unbent now, glancing down its shortened length at his wife and his son and his grandmother, with the almost of a smile that these past weeks had nearly at last become a smile in full. The meal wore on. And then the moment came, the moment Ottilie had watched 3 weeks to catch, when the plates were cleared, and Cosima rose, graceful as spilling water, and went to the sideboard herself, and poured from the dark decanter a single glass of the Duke's particular wine, and carried it to him with her own white hands, and set it before him, and said sweetly, "You must drink, Constantine, to your grandmother's long years." And the Duke's hand moved to the glass, and Ottilie was already on her feet. "Do not drink it, your grace." The words came out of her not loud, but absolute, cutting across the warm room like a blade drawn clean, and the whole table froze with the Duke's fingers on the stem of the glass, and his eyes lifting to hers in astonishment. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Cosima recovered first, with a laugh like breaking glass. "My dear," she said, "whatever can you mean? You have quite alarmed us. Sit down. You are unwell." But Ottilie didn't sit. She came down the length of the shortened table in her grey dress, with her back straight as a spine that has held a roof for years, and she said, in a voice that did not shake, "I mean, your grace, that there is death in that cup, put there by the hand that carried it to you, and I can prove it, here, now, before you all, if you will grant me the length of a breath." The room did not move, and into that stillness, before Cosima could summon another laugh, Ottilie drew from the folds of her dress the old apothecary's vial. She did not touch the Duke's glass. She was too clever for that, for a woman who takes up the cup can be said to have tampered with it, and she meant to leave no such door open. Instead she said, "With your grace's leave," and waited until the Duke, his eyes never leaving her face, gave one slow nod, and then she took a clean, empty glass from the sideboard and set it in the centre of the table, where every eye could follow it. And she asked the Duke himself to pour into it a measure from his own suspected cup, so that no hand but his had moved the wine. And he did, his face a mask, the dark liquid running from the poisoned glass into the clean one under the blaze of the candles. Then Ottilie unstoppered the old man's vial and let 3 drops of the clear reagent fall into the wine, and she stepped back, and she folded her hands, and she said, "If I am a liar and a hysteric, as this lady says, then nothing will happen, and I will kneel to her and beg her pardon before you all." And they watched. The whole table leaned toward the little glass in the candlelight, the old dowager gripping the arms of her chair, the boy wide-eyed, the Duke gone still as carved stone, Cosima with a smile fixed upon her face that had begun, at the corners, to come apart. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, and then the wine in the glass darkened. It did not darken slowly. It bloomed black from the centre outward, like ink dropped in water, like rot spreading through fruit, like the truth coming up through a lie, until the whole measure stood thick and lightless as tar, and a small sound went round the table, an indrawn breath from 4 throats at once, and the smile fell off Cosima's face entirely, and left behind it something white and cornered and old. "It is a trick," she said, but her voice had lost its honey and found only its ice. "She has poured something in. She carries poison in her dress. Ask why a duchess goes about with vials. It is she who plots, she who married for gold, she who would be rid of me." But the Duke had risen. He rose slowly to his full height at the head of the table, and the mask had gone from his face, and beneath it was something Ottilie had never seen there, a cold white fury that made the Frost Duke's old coldness seem a summer thing, and he looked not at his wife, but at Cosima, and he said, in a voice from which every trace of grief and gentleness had been burned away, "You carried the glass." And Cosima, who had 1 card left and played it because it was all she had, turned to him with her arms open and her eyes brimming suddenly with tears she had kept ready for years, and she cried, "Constantine, you cannot believe this creature over me. This nothing, this bought woman in her rag of a dress. I have loved you. I have waited. I can be everything to you that she can never be. Look at her and look at me. I can give you sons whole and fair, not marked, not broken. I can hire 50 like her, and you would throw me over for a servant." And the words hung in the ringing air, and the boy Caspar at the table put his marked face down and began, silently, to cry, and something in the room broke, and something else was born. The Duke came round the table. He did not raise his voice, and this was somehow more terrible than any shouting, for he spoke with the flat finality of a man reading a sentence already past. "You will not speak of my son again," he said, and Cosima fell silent as though struck. Then he turned, and he looked at Ottilia, standing there in her mother's mended grey dress, with her hands folded, and her tears still unspent behind her steady eyes, and everything in his hard face opened at once, and he began to speak. And what he said not in a whisper, but rising, gathering, addressed to her but meant for the whole of that room, and the whole of that mountain, and the world that had called her nothing. "You ask me to look at her and look at you," he said, "and I have done so every day for 3 years and every day these last months. And I will tell you now, before my grandmother and my son and God, what I see. I see a woman who came up my mountain, owing everything and asking for nothing. I see a woman who opened the doors of my house that I had not the courage to open, who found my son where I had hidden him, and did not flinch from his face, but got down upon the floor and made him laugh. I see a woman who wears one dress and has more dignity in its mended hem than this whole house has in all its silver. I see a woman who has never once wept for herself in all her hard life, and who tonight has saved the 2 lives I have left in this world, and who did it not with weeping, but with patience, and with courage, and with truth. You say I would throw you over for a servant. I tell you, I would throw over the whole of my name, and my lands, and my cold empty castle for the least hour of her company. For she is not my servant, and she was never my bargain. She is my wife, and I am, God help me, and about time, in love with her." He turned then to Cosima, and his voice went cold again, and final. "You will leave this house tonight," he said. "You will leave it with what you can carry and no more, and you will go down my mountain and never come up it again, and you will thank the mercy of the woman you tried to make a widow that I send you to exile, and not to the magistrate, for she has asked me, I can see it in her face, to spare you even that, and I find tonight that I can refuse her nothing. And Cosima, beautiful and ruined and suddenly, terribly ordinary, looked round the table and found not one face that pitied her in the way she wished, and every face that pitied her in the way she could not bear, and she gathered the wreck of her dignity about her like a torn shawl, and she went out of that warm room into the cold, and the great door of Rabenstein closed behind her, and did not open again. What remained after she had gone was silence, but it was a different silence than the one Ottilie had first walked into. No longer the silence of a house holding its breath against grief, but the quiet of a room that has finally been made warm. The Dowager Wilhelmina reached across the table and took her granddaughter-in-law's roughened hand in her ringed one, and held it hard and said nothing at all, which from that fierce old woman was a whole oration. And Caspar lifted his marked face, wet and wondering, and asked in his small, careful voice whether the fox in tomorrow's story might, this time, find its way home. And Ottilie went to him, and gathered him up and told him, yes, that it always had been going to. that it had only lost the road a while. The spring came fully then, as it does even to that high, cold country, and the roses on the southern wall broke into a stubborn crimson bloom, red as a coal against the grey stone, and Caspar was carried out to see them, and then, one bright morning, walked out to see them on his own 2 legs, his chest at last unclenching in the mountain air. The Duke had the shutters thrown wide across the whole of Rabenstein, and the dust sheets folded away, and the servants brought back one by one, and music, after 3 long years, moved again through the galleries, and Ottilie, who had come up the mountain in a mended grey dress to be overlooked, was overlooked no longer, for a man who had kept his heart in ice had given it, whole and thawed, into her steady keeping. So remember, when the cold comes to your own house as a creditor, certain of its welcome, that the warmest hearts are often the ones the world has told to bend and break, and that quiet courage outlasts the loudest cruelty every time. If Ottilie's long winter warmed you, share this story with someone weathering their own, and subscribe, so the next tale finds you when the nights are long and you have need of it.